Hello, interwebs, and welcome to another episode of Paul Owen and Dr. Witz's Colloquium on Games of Strategy by Dixit, Skeeth, and Riley, Episode 10. I'm Austin Smokewitz, one half of Dr. Wictz.
I'm Aaron Hanswitz, the other half of Dr. Wictz.
I'm Paul Owen of Dice Tower News.
And today we are in Chapter 10, Strategic Moves. All right.
We're in it, Austin?
We are in it.
I'm just impressed that we've talked about this enough that the authors have decided to include us in their writing. That really is a big compliment. and I'm glad to be honored.
And as you should be. So, as we move into this chapter,
Okay, I have to go up. Yeah, go ahead. Okay, I'm bringing supplies up. I'll be back.
We didn't cover the contingency of what if he says he's going to be back. Is this like the intermission in the Monty Python movie?
I have no idea. He's
never actually coming back.
He might not actually come back.
Yeah.
And we have a viewer. Oh, well, poor timing. Okay, so let's at least start off then by talking about the overarching concept of the strategic move.
Sure, absolutely.
And in the broadest possible sense, the idea of the strategic move is a thing that you can do, and there are various things that they go through in this chapter, to try to enhance yourself, diminish your opponent, change the game state in one way or another without actually changing any of the payoff tables.
Right.
And there's a slight technicality there, but at the end of the day, the payoff table doesn't change, but the items, but the thing you're doing around it will change how you behave looking at that payoff table.
Yeah, one of the fascinating things about some of our earlier discussions was how with the same payoff table, the outcome of the game changes if you make it a sequential move game versus a simultaneous move game, or change the order of play, first player versus second player. So then the notion of a strategic move is taking some kind of an action that changes that structure, at least in your opponent's eyes, in a way that thereby changes the decision that your opponent makes and changes the outcome of the game in your favor.
Right.
At least that's my interpretation of the concept of a strategic move.
Right. And
well, it's really building on a lot of stuff we've already been doing. We just didn't realize that we were jumping ahead. We were purposely manipulating and changing the game to try to change it to our advantage. We were actively changing the rules in an effort to game the game.
Right.
Well, that always seems to be the natural inclination of a gamer. The first thing, if they don't know the entire rule set, they will just naturally try to play the game to their fullest advantage. And then other people have to be like, no, you can't do that. Well, where does it say in the rules? Well, it says you have to flip through here and find the passage. And
well, and this starts getting to the different types of strategies they undertake to do this. But that's where like the big picture descriptions here are really useful, because the book makes a point to categorize things in two sets of important categories when describing your efforts. But even before it gets to that, it gets to the point that when you think of a game, once you're doing strategic thinking, you think of it, there's the original game and there's the modification, and that becomes a two-step game.
Yes. Right. You're sort of, is it right to think of it as a pre-game in a way? You're sort of pre-posturing the way the main game is going to be played by making your strategic move up front?
Well, it's you creating a new game where the first part is the part you're added up to, and the second part is within the framework of the old game of how the added part has manipulated it.
Right.
So, I mean, it really doesn't matter if you think of it as pre-posturing or if you think about it as a new game. It's going to be the same thought process. The key thing is when you think about it, you pick a paradigm where you clearly see the parts. And we can call it an A-B part. A part's the manipulation, B part the old game and how it's been changed in response to that manipulation. And if there wasn't an A part, it would just be the original game B that you had before this first A step was added.
So let me jump right in with an example that came to mind because I don't know what the answer is to this question. So let's talk about how Black Friday works since we're coming up on Thanksgiving, right? And naturally, there's a desire to attract a clientele by lowering prices. But somewhere along the line, it also came to, if I open my store earlier, I attract clientele that might otherwise be going to my competitor's store. And then there becomes this one-upmanship where everybody's trying to open their store earlier than everybody else. And I think that's a dynamic that always confused me, maybe because I don't like to shop on Thanksgiving. But evidently it's effective. In fact, so far to the point where I think I heard an announcement recently, Target has decided they're going to open their doors 6 o'clock Thanksgiving evening, close the stores at midnight, and then open them again the following morning. So they kind of get the best of both worlds.
Mm-hmm. I think Best Buy did a thing like that last year as well. And of course, the part of the problem is that these retailers are also having to compete with the online space as well, which theoretically never closes.
Right.
And is never.
And it's interesting to me, too, that there's been this effect of Cyber Monday, where people get online on Monday from work, never mind the fact that they had 4 days off at home, and then do their shopping that way.
And so,
but yeah, so that kind of, so I'm assuming that part of the whole opening my store earlier than my competitor is part of this kind of strategic move thinking, where I think there's a first mover advantage in opening my store first, and then whether or not my competitors' prices are lower, I am giving my customers or potential customers an earlier opportunity to get the cheap TV in my store before they have to worry about waiting for the cheap TV at the other store. I'm kind of thinking that's how that strategic move happens.
Well, there's also this question about what are you competing over? This is where I'd love to have some market research. How much energy do these customers have? Is the thrill of being the first to do something and then you peter out? Or is it just this constant attraction to a big event? Or is this constant attraction to this entire shop, you drop? But even then, if I say shop, yeah.
So the thinking also is then that the customers have the highest energy when the first store opens, whatever that first store is.
And of course, considering that it's Black Friday, the hope is that in some way there's a finite number of people and in a geographical area, and if you can get them to wait at your front door for 3 or 4 hours and not at your competitors, then yeah, by the time they're done waiting in line, getting in, getting their thing, getting out, will they go to your competitor's store? Probably, but how many?
Well, I mean, I'm sure they're much money as they can out of them versus where you go to the competitors.
Exactly. And wouldn't you want them waiting in line at your store and not at your competitor's store?
Right.
And if you can get them there because you open earlier to give them the goods they want, then that is to your advantage and not to your competitors.
I mean, it's a good question. But the challenge with that game is that a game where they are engaging in strategy, or that's just a continuous game? Have we not left the game B, game A paradigm? The thing I worry about with the Black Friday example is that was the initial game in the first place. Are they changing the rules or not?
And yeah, in my mind, the game was a price, just a simple price, simultaneous pricing game. If I can get this the same TV at Walmart for $400 and at Target for $450, then I'm more inclined to buy it at Walmart. But then if Target opens an hour before Walmart, and there's only so many TVs available at Walmart and so many TVs available at Target, am I more likely to go to the store that opens first, thinking that that's my first chance to get that TV? And is that so? That's I see. But your point, I guess, is that the main game? Not is that not a strategic move?
Because if you're describing that being the purpose of the timing, then it's still just the same game, and it's just on a continuous time scale.
Gotcha. So it's a game on a scale, not strictly a pricing game.
Well, no, it's not strictly just a pricing game, but it's not strictly a. No, when we're talking about games of strategy, we're taking a game and we're completely modifying that game.
Okay.
So, if we're talking about chicken, we're trying to find a way to make a commitment that drives an equilibrium that would have not existed without that commitment. That isn't the issue we're describing here with Black Friday. We're not changing the game. We're just having people calculate the better Nash equilibrium for the pre-existing game.
Oh, I see. I think I see the difference. So it would be more of a strategic move if I maybe announced a price for the TV ahead of time. I'm going to sell this TV for $200. Mm-hmm. And then my competitor says, well, there's no way I can compete with that price, so I'm going to modify what I'm going to do on Black Friday as a result of what assuming that I believe that advertised price is credible. And of course, if you say there's truth in advertising laws, so I can't advertise a price and then not honor it, then so that would be a credible signal. That would be my move. I get first mover advantage from that.
Yes.
And then my competitor backs out.
For only the first 50 TVs.
Right.
First 100, 200, that's usually the modifier though in a black that's usually the restriction that you'll find in the fine print of those Black Friday sales, is that those type of doorbusters are only there for in very limited quantities,
right,
for the first 100 to 200, 300 people that show up at the door. So
which motivates people to get there as early as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I'm going to push us more into the board game round. I mean, I'm honored you guys are thinking econ, but really, this is directly applying to board games. I think this is one of the most strongly chapters affecting the board games. We're talking about modifying how people play a game by either making threats or promises,
right?
By making a response function, or by making a conditional move,
right?
And I know I just read a lot of vocab words from the book right there, but these are very important concepts that apply to how can you strategically manipulate a game to your advantage.
Right.
So one of the most basic examples of this is that, I'm playing a game of Risk. I set up my territory. I put my troops, all of my troops down in Brazil, and I'm about to attack Argentina. And the person who has Argentina turns to me and says, if you attack me, you will have an enemy for the rest of the game. I will not try to win. I will just come after you.
And so, and let's look at that. That's a lot of things in that statement.
Yeah.
That's a threat. A threat is a thing that you will hurt an opponent. They don't do what you want.
To the possible detriment of themselves.
Yep.
Right.
It's a response, because the response is something you do afterwards. We're not committing to do something no matter what. And it's a deterrence. You're trying to deter them from doing something.
Right. So it's a deterrent threat. Right.
Yes.
And I do like that example, because in some ways that is usually the most that's the most basic with all of those parts that complexity stacks up pretty quickly. But in the realm of board gaming, that's kind of like some of your most basic level is I see you do something,
right,
and now I threaten you if you try to take action against me.
So the interesting thing to me about that kind of threat, and I agree with you, is when we get to the section about credibility, what makes that threat a credible threat? Like I say, well, I'm going to not even try to win the game anymore. I'm just going to hurt you. That doesn't make any sense from the standpoint of why would I give up on winning the game? That's why I'm playing the game in the first place. And also, I'm not doing anything to tie my hands, for example, to I don't necessarily have to carry out my threat. So if you threaten me, or say if I threaten you, you might say, well, I think he's going to try to win anyway. That's going to stop him from trying to win. And he's going to attack me anyway if he needs to attack me to win. So it's not much of a threat. So I'm going to attack Argentina anyway. So yes. So that's, and I love this thing about the credibility of a threat is you have to do something to make it reasonable to believe that he's going to carry out the threat if he actually does it. So risk might not be a good example from the standpoint of you can't really well, I don't know. So maybe this is a different way of so I'm going to give myself a counterexample, right? So suppose we're playing Risk, and I'm in a position. I have Argentina. You're all ready to attack me from Brazil, and it's my turn. I will, and I have. Let's suppose I have the opportunity to attack Iceland, or to take over North America or something like that. And I say, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to position all of my troops around Brazil. Or your, capital, whatever. I'm not going to bother to try to take North America, which would get me a whole lot of armies. I'm just going to worry about attacking you and ignoring all my other opponents. So that would be a credible signal that my threat, that I mean what I say when I issue my threat.
No, but that actually is not a credible signal.
Really?
Because if you station everyone around Brazil, then you can't credibly promise that you're not going to attack Brazil.
Oh, I see. So in other words, so then my Brazilian opponent might feel like, well, I'm going to get attacked anyway.
Correct.
Right.
I see.
I mean, with something like Risk, you probably have to rely more on your reputation from repeat play.
Right.
Or if you're playing with enough players and you're trying to convince everyone else that you're this crazy sort of person not to mess with,
right.
You make that threat and you make sure you carry it out on it the first time to demonstrate that you are that sort of crazy person to build your reputation within the game.
The premise being that Risk is a long enough game that you can establish reputation early in the game, and then your future threats will carry more weight.
Correct.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But you also have to make sure that when you make those threats, if someone tests you on it, you have to respond. So you don't make threats lightly.
Oh, I see. So if I make this threat, if Austin is in position to attack me in Argentina, and I threaten Austin and say, "Don't you dare attack me, or I will make it my life's work to defeat you," and Austin actually backs down, then nobody knows whether my threat was credible or not.
Correct.
There's that.
Yeah.
But if the bigger worry is you make that threat and Austin does attack you, you have to follow through on it.
I have to follow through. Absolutely. Yep.
The first time you stop following through on it, people will no longer treat those threats as credible, and you no longer get the benefit of making threats. They no longer serve as an effective way to change the game.
That's the game of parenting right there. If you don't threaten punishment that you're not prepared to carry out.
Right.
And that's one of the great things. That this book really emphasizes a variety of strategies where you can try to make yourself credible. But I do want to keep putting on, make sure we understand this terminology, because I mean that example we had there in Risk, that was a threat, which means you punish harm.
Right.
That was a response function, which means you responded to an action.
Right.
And that was a deterrence. You're there trying to stop someone from doing something. We have other paths in games. We could talk about things that instead of being a deterrent, could be try to compel someone to do something with you. So we could easily modify that story about if you help me take South America, I will help you take Australia.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, if you were to tell Austin, if you attack Paul in Argentina, then I will not attack you in New Guinea, and I will let you finish your takeover of Australia.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And Austin says, yeah, that sounds great to me. And I'm going, hey, you guys are ganging up on me.
Yeah, just a little.
Then I need to come up with my own strategic move.
Right.
Yeah, you need, or undermine our strategic moves.
Right.
You know, you can work to try to undermine the credibility of our deterrence or compellence to our response functions. But you know that those are response functions. Those are not things where we preemptively make something. You know, there are games where people will try to preemptively say, "I'm doing this." The rest of you have to base your strategy on what I'm going to do.
Right. Right. And that's effective depending on how credible it is.
But you know, in that sense, you're trying to commit to a move before anyone else does anything. So you know, if you're playing a game where you're trying to see who's going to gang up on someone, you're the person that stopped them. No, you're the person that stopped them. I've already made my move. It's not going to be me. One of you guys have to do it. There's my move. I'm not changing.
Yep.
You brought up a wonderful example early on in the series about you being in a game where you passed off the responsibility of someone else,
right,
of having to stop the other player.
Right. That was the Seven Wonders example where I had the advantage of being in a sequential. It was a sequential move game where I could burn the science card, or I could pass it to my opponent on the left, and the opponent on his left was the one who was building up science. And if I don't burn the science card, then the opponent to my left has to.
How do you burn a card in Seven Wonders?
Two ways. You can sell it for 3 coins, or you can play it face down to build your wonder.
And how would he not burn it and give it to the next player? He just gives it to the next player?
Yeah, Seven Wonders is a drafting game where you choose one card out of the hand and pass the rest of the hand to the opponent on your left.
So they have to pre-commit. They're going to say, if they're reading the board, they're going to say, if you give me the science card, I'm just going to give it to the next guy.
Yeah, that's a good point. So his strategic move is, I suppose it's a threat, right?
Yeah, it's a threat.
You give me any science cards, I'm not stopping. I'm going to play what I want to play, and I'm going to pass the science to him. Then it's on me to bury the science card.
Yeah, of course that might be not a. That's probably a response function. Thinking about it.
Well, sort of not. The problem is, in order to be able to pull that off in that particular game, you have to have enough foresight. You have to be able to look to the player on your left and say, oh, he's going for a lot of science. And you look to the player on your right, and you have to say to them, hey, don't give me any science cards, because it's just going to go straight to him.
Right. I'm playing blue. You know, I'm playing civics buildings, and you hand me a hand with a blue card and a green card. I'm playing the blue and passing the green, and he's going to get the science. And so if you want to bury the science, you got to bury it, because I'm not going to do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that takes a very conscious and aware player that has to realize that game state, that that Paul would actually have an interest in not allowing the other guy to have the science, even though he wouldn't take the science himself, because it's not optimal to his build.
Right.
That's tough.
Well, but I mean, that's what we want to start thinking about is games where people can preemptively commit to doing something and force everyone else to plan around them. Or games where you can do that, you might have not done it before, but now you're thinking, well, maybe this isn't a bad idea.
Right. Yeah. Because frankly, if that threat works, I mean, the risk is if I receive a hand, if I'm the guy to the right of the science player, right, and I know if I give him a green card, he's going to score a bundle of points, probably more than I'm going to get by playing my blue card, right? Mm-hmm. But if I tell the guy to my right, don't give me any green cards, because I'm just going to give them to the guy on my left, and he believes my threat and buries the green card for me, now I get the best of both worlds. I get a hand with a blue card in it. I can play my blue, get my points, pass a hand to the partner on my left that's worthless to him. I get the best of both worlds. But the threat has to be credible. And to your point, to make it credible, I have to have done it in the past, I guess.
Well, that's one strategy. I mean, there's a whole list of strategies that you can try to do to make things credible.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, this is where, if you want to, you can go to that section of the book on credibility and start going through them one by one. We can talk about how you could use those strategies in a variety of games.
So I was just looking at that, and there were two in particular that they highlight for making strategic moves credible. One of them was limiting your options. All right,
Mm-hmm.
so that kind of goes when you're playing chicken, throwing your steering wheel out the window, right?
Mm-hmm.
So limiting your own future options is the one, and the other one was reducing your payoffs from the temptation to renege on your own threat or promise.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little difficult to do. Seven Wonders is a pretty structured game. I'm not like, for example, if you give me that green card, I've got the temptation to bury it because I know the other guy's going to score the points, and my options are not limited. There's no way to kind of like tie my hands and keep me from burying that green card, that science card.
So, now if you're playing, say, Ticket to Ride,
Okay.
you can start making deals by reducing your paths, by purposely playing cards that you would need to go that would involve stabbing someone in the back. So it takes green to go here. You see I've played all my green on these gray spots over here. I'm committing to not stabbing you in the back so you can trust me.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
Or you do it the other way around. You can say, look, I only have red cards in my hand. You know I'm going to go that way. Why bother? Yeah. Let me have it.
Right. Interesting. I can't remember if there's a rule in Ticket to Ride about showing other players your hand.
Well, that's the great thing about games of strategy. Whether there's a rule or not, people can still engage in this.
Still trying to do it.
You can say anything you want.
You can say it. Yeah.
Now, I know that in Spartacus, for example, there's a Spartacus. Maybe I'm confusing with another game, but I think in Spartacus, you can say anything you want, but you're never allowed to show a card. If you show a card, you are playing it. So I can't like show somebody a scheme card that's threatening and say, I'm going to play this card on you unless you do X. I can claim that I have that scheme card. But if I show it to them, then I'm playing it on them.
It's a good rule.
Yeah. Age of Renaissance has the same rule.
Well, I mean, they're trying to, what'd be really neat is play Spartacus without that rule and see what happens.
Yes, that would be very neat. Yeah.
Because then you can see whether or not you'd start implementing more of these strategies.
Yes. Because that is, you guys have played it, right?
No.
That is.
No, I have not played Spartacus.
Oh, that is an evil game. I have very clear memories, especially with Keith Ferguson. I have very clear memories of,
You always winning?
No, I don't know that I always win. I might have beat him once. But, it's like, Keith, I will play this card on you, but if you give me 2 coins, I'll play it on Brian instead. That kind of thing. Right. And I've learned in that game, early in the game, you carry out your threats or you carry out your promises until later, and so that later in the game, when you want to backstab somebody, you have the credibility, somebody will follow through, and then you can stab them in the back. So yeah, that's an excellent game. That is a game rich in possibility for the kind of strategic moves that we're talking about. Full of threats and promises. Money can change hand any time. You can say anything you want about the cards you play. Yeah, it's a great game for that.
But you see, I'm the breaker of board games. I'm pushing you guys to use this on other games you normally did not think there were possibilities for.
That's good.
This would work great for Catan.
For Catan?
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think of examples. So let's suppose there's a situation where Austin and I are building roads toward the same juncture, right? We're kind of racing towards a certain spot. Is this the kind of circumstance where you're thinking this kind of strategic move would come through?
It's a possibility.
Start to.
I would certainly stop trading with him at that point.
I would say, Austin,
potential boycotts. Yes.
You're going to let me build that road. If you don't let me build that road, I'm going to spend the rest of the game making knights, and my knights are always going to you.
Okay. You threaten me with the thief.
Threatening him with
the knives. Knights. Threaten me with the soldiers. Right.
And that's be the rest of my game from this point on. Nothing else for me to do. Send knights after you.
But it's still a risk problem.
I hope you have enough ore to pull that off.
It's okay. I'll trade with everyone else.
Makes the threat credible.
Austin, I'll trade with everyone else. In fact, I'll trade at ridiculous rates with everyone else.
All right. 2 wheat and a brick for 1 ore. Come on. You know you want that. Okay.
All for the sake of playing a soldier and sending the robber to Austin just because he built that road.
Well, which is actually a good example in Catan, because oftentimes you will have two people racing for the same spot, and if one player gets it, the other player is effectively starts to become hemmed in to the board and now has their growth potential completely shot. So it's worth it to make that sort of threat, because if you can see that losing out on that position will detrimentally harm you for the rest of the game, you become actually more of a credible threat, because everybody can see that you're not in a position to win anymore. So you might as well make the threat that, well, what else am I going to do the rest of the game? I'm going to punish you for this.
That seems a shame, though, to think that your strategic moves become more effective when you lose the possibility of winning the game.
But you know players that play like that.
I do know players that play like that.
Yes, we do.
And it now makes strategic sense.
Now we know what's going on.
Well, I think, so Paul, how long does it take to play Spartacus?
Probably a couple hours.
It's a couple hours?
Yeah.
Because in my reading of this, while reading through the chapter, I was thinking that there are many examples of games where you have this type of the threats, the promises, the ability to gain credibility, and you're able to play out all of these mechanics. But I always found that these types of games happen a lot in board gaming, but they're also not the core focus of the game. It's usually just a consequence of the fact that a game is complex enough and has enough time to allow players to play out these more complicated schemes of threats and promises. There's enough mechanically going on, and there's enough time within the game to do it. So in my continuing board game challenge series, it would be interesting to have a game that was set up from the get-go to allow for these, that was built around these interactions, and actually end up making it be a game that played in less than an hour.
So construct a game.
To construct a game around it. And the question is that possible?
You fool, Austin.
You fool.
That is such an interesting social game because of the fact that I don't have to worry about being the lone winner. I just have to worry about not being the lone loser. And so a lot of deals can be made very easily that way. And I rather like that for that reason.
And if you want to be spiteful, you can be spiteful against the same player for the rest of the game.
Yes. I can always try to hit Keith Ferguson with a beach ball.
Or keep him down in the clown car.
Let's keep him in the clown car, yeah.
And you have lots of opportunities to engage in response functions or conditional strategies.
Right, yes. All in 20 minutes.
All in 20 minutes. No matter what, you're going to get this card no matter what. I'm pre-committing. What card do I have? up. You haven't looked at it. Well, it's up.
But my question here is there enough space within the game to effectively pull that off?
You mean where the threats, where the strategic moves are credible?
Well, not so much if it's credible, but like in that game, there's only 5 actions and it only takes 20 minutes.
Right.
But it's one of these things where I don't necessarily see players playing it that way. So are we now suggesting that players should play it that way?
Well, so I think Keith and I play it that way with each other.
Okay.
So there's that rivalry factor, you know. Should they play it that way? No, in a way, there's a I do remember a particular negotiation during Unpub when we were first playtesting it, where it seemed like the conspiracy just turned on a dime. You know, we were all trying to get, I think we were all trying to get Keith in the clown car, and then all of a sudden, like in no time, it was, no, I think we should put Aaron in the clown car. It's like, I think Aaron, I felt like Aaron was trying to negotiate his way out of a paper bag, because all of a sudden it was like, well, no, I think we should all win and Aaron should lose. But wait.
This card is up.
So this card is up. Right. And that's kind of a cool thing about that game, is that it really can turn on a dime like that. So it's rich, I think, with strategic move possibilities. It's like, and that could be it too. It could be, you know, don't put me in the clown car, or I will turn everybody else against you, or something like that. You know,
especially early on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you do have that defining moment the first time gets knocked off the top.
Yeah.
Oh, then yes.
That's right. The beach ball's coming for you, Bob.
And because it is a 20-minute game, it's pretty common to play it multiple times. So if you want to carry something over from game to game.
Yes. Build a reputation. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, if it's a bunch of new players, you need to play with them a few times to develop that. I think that's true for most games. And either you achieve that by having a long game, or you achieve that for repeated play in the game.
Yes. It occurs to me that the less structured a social game, the more prone it is to this kind of thing. Tell me if you would agree. I think about things like Resistance and Werewolf, where you don't have a lot of data to base your decision making on, and so you have to kind of create impressions or communicate intent, stuff like that, to try to sway the decision making. But that's where I start to. I think one thing, as I was reading this chapter, one thing I was confusing was what somebody like Chris Kurtman would call metagaming, is kind of talking outside the game, trying to negotiate and convince people to do things. Is that the same thing as the strategic moves that we're talking about, or is that really something different?
I think there's a slight difference, because in the last chapter we talked about risk and, well, we talked about uncertainty and information. We talked about babbling talk, and we talked about talk. Here, one of the things but we talked about that last time. What they focus on specifically here is the concept of making moves. So you can make threats and promises, but in order for it to be, again, it gets back to the credibility. You have to be able to, other people have to observe that you're doing it, and what you do has to be irreversible.
Yes.
So we are now moving away from cheap talk and just talk, and cheap talk and babbling and signal jamming, and we're moving on to the point now where actions are being taken within the game, but
commitments that are, like you said, irreversible.
Commitments that are irreversible, which means that you still have to do something, but with the understanding that you still have to make those threats and promises before you do something, but this is the point where you're now carrying out those actions. I think that's, yeah.
And that's the great thing about You Fool. You Fool, people have to make a move. They get to see what happens, and the information gets revealed. There's some of that in the Resistance. You know who gets nominated. You know who gets nominated again. But once people actually submit those cards, you don't
you
know
don't know exactly who put in what. And that's really the main tension point in the Resistance, is trying to figure out who put in what. Sure. Whereas with You Fool, as long as you don't, or other people don't mix up the cards, right, you know who was telling you what and how it fared it out from turn to turn.
Yes. Right. Everything's traceable back to the person who did it. Yes.
Yeah.
And so every action is a true commitment, and every threat or promise is, you can tell whether it was carried out or not. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, if you want to think of another game that gives you these sort of possibilities, we have to bring up diplomacy. And that's because the movement of your troops in diplomacy is you showing what you did in a way that everyone can see, and you can move them in a position where you successfully burn your bridges to do things and communicate you're going to take a particular action.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought up diplomacy, because one of the unofficial things I learned about that game over years of playing it is that if you are a player and you tell the group that you have actively declared war on another player, your chances of winning has just dropped, because everybody else will say to themselves, oh, that means I now know that all of your forces are going to go that way, which means if I'm on your backside, now that just is an open invitation to myself to come in and take your take your open backside.
Right.
So it always seemed better in that game to, even if you were at war with somebody, to always be more non-committal about it than you actually were, unless you had a really strong ally who would be going along with you in said endeavor.
So, Austin.
Yeah.
Why don't I declare war against you, but it's a ruse, so we throw someone out of position that you want to invade?
Yes, exactly. So if you're Germany and I'm Austria-Hungary and you declare war on France, that means that Turkey and I now will have a backdoor to Russia as he tries to plow westward into the back door of Germany.
Yeah,
that might work. That might work.
I'm reminded a little bit of a game of Survivor, where the negotiation going on leading into tribal council was something like, okay, let's tell everybody that we're voting for you. And the guy that they were all pretending to vote for was like, I'm not so sure I'm comfortable with that plan. Because you may just be saying you're voting for me when really you're voting for me. Yeah, Survivor's another one of those kind of you got to make credible signals kind of a game. You got to be able to make a credible commitment. Yeah, that's a very interesting game. But of course, it's terrible because it's player elimination and it takes 39 days to play, and everybody's hungry. Yeah, you only have to play it once.
Well, unless you're a hero or a villain, and then they'll bring you back for.
Right. That's right.
And then yes.
Right.
So then one of the things that we want to talk about is what I found was really interesting is the idea of what happens when you make a commitment. So at the top of the episode, I talked about how one of the interesting things about these threats and promises is that by making these threats and promises, you are effectively changing the payout without changing the table. And what was really interesting about that is that as you're...
I forgot it was tonight, kind of a thing.
I wonder where my family had gone.
Sorry about that. Yeah, yeah.
It's okay. I'll be out of your hair.
And so one of the interesting things about having these threats and promises is what it does to the payoff table. Is that by committing yourself to taking one action or another, you have the ability to prune off sections of the decision tree for your opponents. So instead of having them look at the entire tree and working their way back to the most optimal or to the natural equilibrium, if you come along with your threats or promises, you can effectively remove entire branches from the decision tree,
right,
and have your opponent look at leading your opponent to different outcomes. And while it doesn't, and I know that we're talking about how strategic moves change the game, and Aaron, you can disagree with me on this, but I feel that what it's actually doing is it's changing players' perception of the game as opposed to actually changing the payoff table of said game.
Well, by eliminating part of the choices, that's the change in the game part.
That's changing the game, yeah.
So if I'm playing Agricola and I tell everyone I'm never going to do any animals, that's my strategic move. I try to think of a pre-commitment to try to change everyone's payoffs here.
Mm-hmm.
Then I'm not changing the fact that we're playing Agricola. What I'm doing is, if you believe me and you think I'm credible, then you're going to make your decisions assuming you don't have to worry about me having sheep, having cows, and just growing crops.
Just growing crops. I have to compete with you for the fishing hole.
Exactly. Or what could you do instead?
Mm-hmm.
This is
right. Then I go for the cows, but yeah.
I mean, if you think about a lot of Euro games, like Santa's Workshop, like Power Grid. I remember playing Santa's Workshop with Paul, and Paul saying, "I love plastic."
Yes.
And I said to myself, "Oh, Paul's doing plastic. Why do I need to do plastic?" I treated Paul as making a pre-commitment to his strategy.
Right.
I let that adjust my payoff tables. And I said, "Plastic's for chumps."
And so the good news for me was you weren't competing with me for plastic. The good news for you was you didn't have to rush to the other parts of the workshop. You didn't have to worry about me trying to take wood before you, or to take whatever the other materials are, metal or fabric. You didn't have to rush to take the metal or the fabric because you could be confident that I would spend at least one action taking plastic. And so you could adjust the order in which you did things.
And so we're still playing Santa's Workshop. It's just that we're using these threats and these promises, these response functions or these commitments to guide that gameplay, hopefully to a spot that's more advantageous to us if we hadn't made them.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I thought what was interesting about that is that this kind of somewhat throws the concept of dominated strategies out the window a little bit. If you can effectively do this, you can change the way the other player looks at the payoff table to suddenly make a dominated strategy not look so good. And that's pretty powerful.
Right. Yeah, yeah. was just looking over the key terms from the chapter before we wrap things up, and there was a couple that were sort of at the extreme end of the things we were talking about. One of them is brinkmanship, which I see as that's a threat where it's like an ultimatum, isn't it? It's sort of the ultimate, an ultimate threat. So let me see how they define it exactly.
Well, for brinkmanship, the way that they described brinksmanship is more along the lines of I want to say it's more like, okay, so they had a phrase in here called salami tactics.
Oh, right. That was another one I was going to get to. Yeah.
Okay, so two different things. All right, we'll talk about them separately.
So brinkmanship is like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where there was Kennedy threatens to initiate a nuclear war if the Soviet Union tries to run the blockade. Now, if the Soviets Navy had called him on his bluff, it would have been disastrous for both sides. But instead, the Soviets backed down. So that was a case of brinkmanship. They were pushing each other to the brink. And if nobody backs down, then it's disastrous for both sides. That's what I understand brinkmanship to reflect, where it's a threat of mutual catastrophe in a sense. It's bad for me and it's bad for you, but I'm hoping to show myself to being sufficiently irrational that I would actually carry out this ridiculous threat that I'm making.
So the way that they define brinksmanship, not in the specific example, but in the broader example, but in a broader context, is that brinksmanship is when you can't make a small credible threat, so you allude to making a very large credible to making a very large threat, and you kind of like you slow walk your way to that threat. You don't say the big thing outright, but you start inching your way. You start taking the steps necessary in order to achieve that larger threat, because taking that threat right off the bat is not credible and possibly not even practical to pull off, but you can start moving in that direction.
Yep.
So it's like, I don't know how much real world example you want to pull in here, but it was like when President Trump decided to, or talks about not reaffirming the Iranian nuclear deal, but only with the internal document that he has to sign every 90 days, not the external document with the international community. But he's taking those movements towards to one day breaking off the deal, but he's doing it in a slow, credible way of knocking down the barriers to keeping the treaty together.
Right. But that also, am I right in thinking that also gives him the negotiating avenue of saying, if you do things my way, we don't have to go through with it.
And that is the hope, that he's attempting to start moving. He's moving in that direction in the hopes of bringing them back to to bring all the partners back to the negotiating table to create a new deal.
Right. Yeah. So I see now. So I think I misinterpreted the definition of salami tactics. What you've described, I think, is consistent with that definition. I was interpreting salami tactics to mean something like, you threaten me with don't attack Argentina. And I say, I won't attack Argentina. I might attack Bolivia. I'm just moving some armies over here. I'm not attacking Argentina, but I'm doing this other thing instead. And look, I have some guys in Peru. How did they get up? I don't know how they ended up there, but hey, before you know it, Argentina's surrounded.
Brinkmanship is movements towards a massive event.
Okay.
Salami tactics are, I'm going to push the boundaries of what's acceptable and unacceptable behavior.
Right.
You said I shouldn't go swimming in the water. Well, I'm not swimming. I just have my feet dangling in the water.
That's right.
And maybe now it's my ankle. And no, I'm not swimming in the water.
I'm not swimming. I'm still resting on the bottom. I'm not swimming.
I'm just waiting.
Yeah.
So salami tactics are just slowly pushing the boundaries to the point where the boundary's no longer there.
Right.
Yeah. So it's more like, so brinksmanship is if you're making the threat, the escalation to the threat, where salami tactics is more like getting out or getting yourself out of a punishment, of a potential punishment, still getting what you want, but getting there slowly. So
without triggering the threat.
Without triggering the threat.
Yes.
So they are like they are the inverse of each other in a way.
But it's interesting. I like what you said earlier about the design challenge of trying to come up with a 20-minute game that motivates these kinds of strategic moves. And yeah, I think You Fool is one of those. It's an interesting idea to think about. How do we incorporate this into game design to actually motivate strategic moves? Give people avenues for creating credible threats, changing their payoff table to make their threats more credible. Like you said, pruning branches off their decision tree.
I think it's actually really common. I think it's common in a lot of game types. I mean, I have to bring up examples in Euros. I think the challenge we have is sometimes the people who are good at these strategies are the exact sort of people that other people say, I don't want to play board games with because they are a bad personality.
And I agree with Aaron that these concepts are littered throughout the board game world, and my challenge hewed more to the how do you have these things be integral to the game as opposed to a consequence of the game.
Yeah.
And then if you can make them integral to the game, then every player is aware and doing it, and then everybody wants to play with each other because that's the game. We're all doing the game.
It's the game we're all playing.
That's right. The game we're all playing, and we're all aware of it. It's not that guy over there who's making his crazy threats.
Right.
We're all doing that in one way or another.
I really think that's the challenge, is that the people who might be good at this for some board game groups is exactly the person they don't want to be playing with.
Yeah.
So we need to design games to let them into the hobby.
All right.
Okay. So we could talk about reputation, I suppose.
We have talked about reputation.
We have.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've hit all the points I wanted to cover. Yeah.
Yeah. Then I guess the last thing that I would want to talk about is just not just moving it beyond board games, but trying to I feel like it would be interesting to reconcile this information and really try to bring it into my everyday life. I wonder if anyone would actually appreciate that.
Only if you didn't tell me you were doing it. And you have to be subtle about it.
I mean, Aaron, you work at a college. I mean, you surely have to deal with this
all the time.
All the time.
And if I do it wrong, people resent me. And sometimes you have to recognize when you have to have resentment. I mean, being a college professor is a lot like being a parent. I'm not your friend and your professor. And so there will be times where my students will use salami tactics against me.
Right. Sure.
And there will be times where I will make offers or talk about consequences. And I know if I do that, I have to carry through.
Right. Have to maintain credibility.
Maintain
your reputation.
my reputation.
All right.
And that's going to wrap it up for Games of Strategy, Colloquium on Games. That's going to wrap it up for the Colloquium of Games of Strategy, episode 10. Strategic Moves. Next time, we're going to be moving on to chapter 11, The Prisoner's Dilemma and Repeated Games. It's going to be so good to get back to the Prisoner's Dilemma, especially since they just told us how to kind of break out of that, but it'll be good to come back into it.
Right.
So thank you for listening to Paul Owens and Dr. Wictz Colloquium on Games of Strategy by Dixit, Skeeth, and Riley. You can find Dr. Wictz at dr.wictz.com or on Twitter at drwictz.
You can find me at Paul Owen on Twitter at Paul Owen Games. And I do still have a blog, although I haven't blogged in a while, but it's paulowengames.blogspot.com. And most commonly, you'll hear me on Dice Tower News, dicetowernews.libsyn.com.
Aaron, did we miss anything?
No, we did well.
All right.
Okay, then I'm going to stop this. Okay, thank you.